In this episode, I'm going to share stories where people believe they encountered a crawler. These stories include two friends who had something run in front of their car one night, a boy who saw a creature behind the shed in his yard, another story where two men were out driving at night and saw something weird, and two friends who saw a strange being while out for a walk one day. But first, we start with a story from a poster who had two different encounters while riding his golf cart at night. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode actually involves two different encounters with a creature from a poster who came across a being while riding his golf cart. He does not say where his encounters took place. The original poster, or OP, and his sister were riding to their friend's house on a golf cart one night. He was in the passenger seat while his sister was driving. He glanced over into a stretch of woods as they were driving past when he saw what he thought was a deer. However, he quickly realized that what he was looking at was no deer. It appeared to be a human on all fours, but he knew that this thing was not a person as it was pale white. It turned then and rushed into the woods, and the OP yelled out in fear without realizing it as he watched the creature run on all fours, saying it was much too fast to be a person. A little later, they were parked at their friend's house, and the OP had the strangest feeling that they were being watched by someone or something. They kept hearing branches snapping and cracking in the woods nearby. The feeling and noises were enough to freak them out. This wasn't the end of the first experience, however, as the day he posted his story online, he had driven past the same stretch of woods where he saw the creature, and noticed a balloon floating in the exact spot where the being started to run or crawl into the woods. He ends his first post by saying he isn't sure if the balloon being there is just a coincidence, but it definitely had him a little spooked. He says he isn't sure what the creature was, but from what he's read, thinks it might have been either a skinwalker or a crawler. The OP's second encounter also happened while out riding his golf cart. He does not say how long it was between encounters. While out riding alone on a calm night in his neighborhood that borders farmland and woods, he stopped because he had a large beetle on his shirt that pinched him. Where he stopped was near a stretch of trees, and he proceeded to try and remove the beetle from his shirt. As he did so, he heard something walking within the trees that sounded like a deer. At first, he wasn't afraid. However, the noises grew closer and louder. The walking had become so loud that it sounded very unnatural, like a dinosaur from Jurassic Park was stomping around, he says. He slammed the gas pedal down and got out of there as fast as he could because the heavy footsteps had grown incredibly close and extremely loud. Although he felt shivers run down his spine, he didn't see anything behind him when he looked back. It seemed like whatever had been walking toward him had just been inches away, according to him. Before his second encounter, he had been researching skinwalkers and talking about them with his sister. He isn't sure if it had anything to do with whatever this was that was approaching him like it did, though. He ends his post by saying he hopes he didn't invite anything into his life and that the stomping was so loud he can't even begin to explain it. It was quite unsettling and sounded surreal, leaving him terrified. There are a number of cryptids that run on all fours, but only a few that are normally mistaken for humans when doing so. The main one that is normally said to look like a human are crawlers. That's what I believe the OP saw during his first encounter while riding to his friend's house with his sister. The way he describes it definitely fits with what others say about their own encounters. The second encounter, though, from the stories I've read and heard, crawlers are usually quiet and don't have heavy footsteps. The way he describes it as sounding like a dinosaur from Jurassic Park makes me think either Sasquatch, Dogman, or even a Wachuge. All three are very large and could produce heavy footsteps like what the OP heard. It very well could also have been something else, but most other cryptids, and sometimes even Sasquatch and Dogman, are said to barely make a sound when running and or walking. but for him to describe it like he did makes me think that it had to have been huge to have footsteps that loud. As for being watched, crawlers, just like many other cryptids, seem to have a morbid curiosity with us and like to observe us when in close proximity. This happens a lot during encounters, and some say a feeling of dread comes over them when this happens. I fully believe that the more malicious cryptids see us as prey and are hunting people when they say they feel like they are being watched. The OP says everyone was freaked out by the sensation, but he doesn't say they were overcome with dread or fear, so maybe this thing just wanted to get a closer look. He also says he hopes he hasn't attracted anything, but I don't think that's the case here. It seems to just be in certain areas where he's had his encounters with whatever is out there. I would try staying away from these locations and see if anything else happens to or around him. Luckily, he hasn't mentioned anything happening around his home. That makes me think it's just the areas of woods he was close to at the time. As for seeing the balloon in the exact spot where he had his first encounter, that seriously gives me It vibes, being that this occurs in that movie. It is very freaky, and I believe I would stay away from that area if I were him. What do you think the OP could have encountered? One cryptid or more than one? And what do you make of the balloon? The next story comes to us from a poster who saw something run in front of their car late one night while out driving with a friend. He does not say where his story takes place. The original poster had been out driving with a friend very late one night at around 2 in the morning, and they had reached a speed of 70 miles per hour. And being that they had a turn coming up, they slowed down so they could take the right turn. Out of nowhere, a tall, lanky figure bounded swiftly in front of them on his hind legs. It was fast enough to avoid the car. It was moving straight toward them and had been conscious enough to avoid being hit by the car, moving, as the OP describes it, like a swoosh in front of them. They both had a hard time finding words to describe what they had just seen, with the silence and the realization of what they saw suddenly hitting them, hanging between them as they tried to process the events that had just transpired before their very eyes. They panicked because the creature had been very quick and just looked unnatural. They reviewed the scenario and considered every possible explanation. But what happened in the creature they saw made no sense. He says it wasn't a rake and it wasn't an extraterrestrial, but it was something inhuman. They just couldn't quite wrap their minds around it. A while later, the topic of the creature came back up and the OP and his friend took to the internet to search for answers. They came across a crawler subreddit, and something in the community bio caught their eye. In the description given for crawlers, it mentions they could be 8 feet tall, which is what his friend's estimate for about how tall the creature that ran in front of their car was. Being that's what she guessed based on the height of the OP's car, this fact in the bio alarmed them. However, it also helped them make sense of what they witnessed that night. He ends his post by saying they wish they had a dash cam, but only have what's in their own minds before attesting to the events of the story being true. Something that always catches my attention about cryptid encounters is how fast these beings are said to be by those who see them run. There are stories where they chase and keep up with cars going well over the speed limit, usually trying to get away from them, or in cases like this where they dart in front of a car and are able to avoid being hit because of how fast they move. Then there are the stories where they cover hundreds of yards in a matter of seconds, moving with inhuman speed. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around when you've never seen it. Of course, I'm perfectly fine hearing it in stories and never having to witness it myself. I don't think this was a normal animal that they misidentified either, because I have had some near misses with animals while driving at night, and in the brief flash of them in my headlights, they are very clearly visible, and it's amazing how much detail you can actually make out in a matter of seconds, or less than that. I can still very vividly see the deer I almost hit one night, and it was in my headlights for less than a second. When the OP says they were able to make out that this thing was tall, had a lanky body, and was running on 2 legs, I believe him. As for what this thing was, from the brief flash he got and the description of the creature based on that, I think this was a crawler. What do you think ran in front of the car that night? The next story of this episode comes from a poster who saw a strange creature behind the shed in his yard he believes was either the rake or a skinwalker. However, upon reading his story, I believe he saw something else, as the rake is a fictional creature created for creepypasta stories, and given the description, it doesn't seem to be a skinwalker. The encounter took place back in July of 2019 when the OP lived in California. One day when he was outside skating, he heard sounds coming from behind the shed in his yard. Curious, he went and looked to see what it was, thinking it might be his neighbor's cat. Instead, he found something tall, thin, and pale that looked human, despite the fact it wasn't wearing anything and had no hair whatsoever. This thing, whatever it was, looked at the OP, who couldn't help but stare at this creature. He could tell it was either eating something or examining something on the ground. He had pets, but they were all indoor animals, and thankfully none of them were outside at the time. He describes the creature's arms as resembling a T-Rex and its eyes being gray. The OP was so startled that he couldn't even bring himself to yell, but did take off running back to his house, peering back through the door when he got inside. He told his brother about the creature behind the shed, but his brother dismissed it as him just being tired, as this all happened at 11 o'clock at night. However, he wasn't tired at all. Additionally, he is in good health and doesn't believe he was hallucinating. Plus, there was more than enough light to see the creature, therefore ruling out him just seeing a tree and believing it was something else. The creature was also very tall, and the OP says there was nothing around for it to stand on to give it the appearance of that height. He ends his post by saying he believes he saw either a rake or a skinwalker. As I mentioned in the intro to this story, the rake is a fictional being based on a crawler, and skinwalkers aren't described as looking like the creature the OP encountered. Unfortunately, recently I have noticed that a lot of cryptids are being misidentified as a skinwalker. This includes everything from crawlers and wendigo to wuchuge and many other types of cryptids. At first, this sounded like a crawler to me, but the way he describes the arms as looking like that of a T-Rex has me a bit puzzled. Usually, crawlers are said to have very long arms. I don't suppose it's out of the realm of possibilities for one to have shorter arms as described in this story, because everything else about this creature makes me think crawler. Or perhaps it is something else entirely. What do you think the OP saw behind his shed that night? The next story comes to us from a poster who relays his friend's story about an encounter he had with something in upstate South Carolina while traveling along an old country road. The area where his story takes place, where they grew up, is very much rural and, according to the original poster, has nothing around for miles. His best friend, who was 36 years old at the time of his posting his story, was driving with a mutual friend down an old country road. They were just out for a drive while drinking some beers when they came upon what at first they thought was a man on all fours, but as they got closer they realized it was not a man. However, it did have the head of a man. This thing's body stretched over half the road, and his friend described it as being a dark ash color rather than pale white. The thing never looked back. All that was visible was the back of this creature's head. They came very close to whatever this thing was, forcing the friend to slam on his brakes, bringing the car to a stop. All the while, his friend was yelling at him to keep driving. However, the friend who was driving got out of the car. The OP says here that you'd have to know him to understand why he would do that. He got a pretty good look at the creature and said it looked like a man with very long legs and arms that were bent backwards, somewhat resembling a grasshopper. He also said that when it moved, it didn't do so like a man, but rather it moved sideways like a crab. The OP ends his post by saying he had a similar experience 2 years later and asks if anyone has ever seen anything like what his friend saw that night. At first, the creature the OP's friend saw sounded like a crawler to me, but then he described the arms as being bent backward like a grasshopper and it walking like a crab when it moved. This has me a little puzzled. I still think this thing could have been a crawler, but the way he describes the arms and how it moves makes me question that. Whatever this thing was, it doesn't seem like it gave off a sense of imminent danger as the friend not only stopped his car but got out. And someone who is filled with a sense of dread, as is usually described in these encounters, would not stop when seeing a creature such as this, much less get out of the car. He is a lot braver than most. I will say here that this is something I do not recommend. He's lucky nothing happened. One thing I want to mention about this story is I find it more believable being that the friend had someone there to back him up on his encounter, and that the OP saw something similar a couple of years later. Multiple people seeing something and then someone else having an experience with either the same creature or something similar adds credibility to these stories for me. What do you think about this one? What did the friend see that night while driving? Also, would you have gotten out of the car to take a closer look? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who believed they encountered a skinwalker, but was directed to a crawler forum by the people there. He then posted his story alongside other crawler stories to see what people thought he may have encountered. He does not say where his story takes place. The original poster and his friend decided to go on a walk after hanging out at her house for a while. Their route would take them through her neighborhood, and as they walked, the feeling of being watched suddenly came over them. He says here it felt like the gaze that had settled upon them was coming from behind him and his friend, as well as some other odd angles. The OP started searching the area trying to see what was watching them, but when he didn't see anything for a while, he began brushing it off. But just as he was about to dismiss the feeling, he turned and looked at a very big water cooler that was near his friend's house. Around the water storage was a lot of foliage amongst other items. Something could very easily be concealed within. He glanced at the structure, then looked away, but immediately knew something was amiss as he had noticed something white protruding from the foliage. He caught sight of a tiny white round object sticking out of a shrub. He says it almost looked like a head. He did a double take, but when he looked back, it was gone. This prompted him to alert his friend as to what was going on, and they picked up their pace. But as they got closer to her house, the OP looked down one of the neighborhood streets that led to an open area with a view of a lake and saw a big gray humanoid figure running on all fours like a dog. He and his friend started walking even faster than they already were and made it back to her house without further incident. The OP at first thought he saw a skinwalker that day, but now believes he saw a crawler after being directed to the proper forums. He ends his post by saying his friend thought he might have been hallucinating or that it was the result of paranoia and asks whoever reads this post what they think. As I mentioned in one of the other stories, cryptids are often mislabeled as skinwalkers. In fact, I see a running joke when searching for stories to tell, when reading or listening to them in my spare time, researching the topic, and on social media that, quote, everything is a skinwalker. This happens the most with crawlers, wendigo, and Wachuge. Crawlers are also misidentified as a rake, which is a fictitious creature based on crawlers. That said, this does sound like a crawler to me based on the description given by the OP. What do you think he saw that day? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.